She was sent there as an insult. Everyone in the kingdom knew it. The family that arranges a marriage into the weakest, most forgotten pack in the territory isn't making an alliance. They're making a disposal, crumbling walls, soldiers in rusted armor, land so barren that even the neighboring packs had stopped bothering to raid it. Nobody envied her, nobody worried about her, nobody thought twice about what happened to a woman sent to the one place in the kingdom that didn't matter. And that was exactly the point, because the moment she crossed that border and started paying attention to what was actually there, not what they wanted the world to see, but what lived underneath the performance of poverty, everything she thought she understood about power, about danger, and about who truly controlled the kingdom began to collapse. The most invisible place in the realm was hiding something that could bring all of it down, and she was already inside. The first thing she noticed was the silence, not the silence of poverty. She had expected that, had prepared herself for the hollow quiet of a place that had given up. This was a different kind of silence, controlled, deliberate, the silence of people who had practiced it. The soldiers who watched her arrive didn't have the sunken posture of men who had lost. They had the stillness of men who were waiting. The servants who led her through those crumbling corridors moved with a precision that didn't belong to a forgotten place. Small things, the kind of things you only catch if you've been trained to look, or if you're the kind of person who has always understood that the most important information in any room is the information nobody is offering you voluntarily. She was that kind of person. And what she was reading in every corner of that decaying estate was not defeat. It was performance. Layers deep, years old, flawlessly maintained. A performance of weakness so convincing that the entire kingdom had stopped looking. And the moment you stop looking at something is the moment it becomes truly dangerous. If something about this already feels familiar to you, stay close. Because what she found behind that performance is the kind of secret that doesn't just change one story. It rewrites the entire kingdom. Her name was Isolde. Not a warrior's name. Not a name that carried the weight of bloodlines or battle histories or territorial claims. Just Isolde. A name her mother had chosen because it was soft, she had said, like the kind of woman who survives by bending rather than breaking. Her mother had meant it as a compliment. Isolde had spent most of her life uncertain whether it was one. She had grown up in the Valdris pack, one of the three most politically prominent packs in the Northern Territories, in a household where power was discussed the way other families discussed weather, constantly, practically, as a fact of the environment rather than a subject of ambition. Her father, Alpha, Brennan of Valdris, was not a cruel man. He was a precise one. He made decisions the way a stonecutter works, with patience, with the understanding that each strike has consequences that extend beyond the immediate surface, with a complete absence of sentiment about the material he was shaping. When he had called her into his study 3 months before her 23rd birthday and told her she was to be married into the Kerveth pack, his tone had been exactly the same as when he discussed harvest allocations or patrol rotations, measured, final, already decided. She had not protested. She had learned over 23 years that protest in her father's study was a transaction with no favorable exchange rate. She had instead asked the question she always asked when presented with a decision she couldn't change. What was the actual purpose of it? Not the stated purpose. The stated purpose of the Kerveth marriage was alliance, a word her father used the way people use furniture, to fill space without drawing attention to itself. The actual purpose. Her father had looked at her for a moment with the specific expression she had come to recognize as reluctant respect. The Kerveth territory borders 3 eastern routes we want access to, he said. Their Alpha requested a formal bond. We're not losing anything of strategic value by agreeing. Not losing anything of strategic value. She had turned that phrase over in her mind for 3 months, through the preparations and the formal proceedings and the journey east, and what she had arrived at by the time the Kerveth border came into view was this. Her father believed the Kerveth pack was worthless enough that giving them a daughter cost him nothing. That was not an alliance. That was a dismissal dressed in ceremony. The Kerveth territory looked, at first approach, exactly like every account she had ever heard of it, which was itself, she noted in some quiet corner of her mind, slightly unusual. Places rarely matched their reputations precisely. There was always some gap between the story told about a territory and the actual texture of it, some detail that complicated the simple version, some element that the people telling the story had edited out because it didn't fit the narrative cleanly. The gap between story and reality was, in her experience, where the interesting information lived. The Kerveth territory had no gap. The roads were poor. The villages they passed through on the approach were sparse and weathered. The buildings functional in the way that things become functional, when there are no resources left for anything else. The people who watched her procession pass were quiet, watchful, unremarkable. The escort that met them at the border, 6 soldiers in mismatched armor that had clearly been repaired multiple times with materials that didn't quite match the originals, was polite, correct, and entirely consistent with a pack that had spent decades being the least interesting political entity in the Eastern Territories. Everything was exactly as described, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. She filed it. She didn't react to it, didn't allow it to change her external presentation, didn't mention it to her attendant Lyra, who rode beside her and whose chattering commentary on the landscape Isolde had been using for 3 days of travel as a kind of social camouflage, letting Lyra's observations fill the conversational space while her own attention moved underneath them, reading everything. She filed the wrongness of the territory's perfect match to its reputation and kept riding. The Kerveth stronghold appeared around a bend in the road with the unhurried quality of something that wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was large, larger than she had expected from the accounts, though still shabby in the specific way of a structure that had been old for a long time and maintained without being improved. The outer walls were thick, stone heavily weathered, with the particular patina of centuries rather than decades. The gates were iron, functional, undecorated. The courtyard beyond them was clean in the way that military spaces are clean, not for aesthetics, but because disorder has operational consequences. The soldiers at the gate. That was the second thing. There were 8 of them. Standard gate complement for a pack stronghold of this size, nothing remarkable in the number. What was remarkable, and what she caught, in the 3 seconds she spent passing through the gate at a measured pace that gave her exactly the right angle of observation, without appearing to observe, was the quality of their stillness. Not the bored stillness of garrison soldiers in a forgotten posting. Not the performative alertness of soldiers who know they're being watched and are adjusting their posture accordingly. Something else. The stillness of people who have trained their bodies to be completely quiet as a functional skill rather than a social one. The kind of stillness that takes years to develop. The kind you see in soldiers who have been preparing, specifically and seriously, for something that hasn't happened yet. 8 soldiers at a gate in a poor, irrelevant pack territory with the stillness of an elite unit. She rode into the courtyard and began composing, in the organized architecture of her memory, a list. The greeting was performed by the Alpha's steward, a tall, thin man named Corvus, who had the precise manners of someone who had studied courtesy as a discipline rather than absorbed it as a social habit. He was welcoming, correct, and gave away nothing except that he was extremely good at giving away nothing, which was itself a form of information. He told her that Alpha Rendrick would receive her formally that evening, that she would be shown to her quarters, that she was welcome to rest from her journey. He said all of this with the smooth efficiency of a man who had given this speech before, which meant the pack had hosted arrivals of consequence often enough to develop a protocol for it, which was inconsistent with the reputation of a territory that nobody visited because nobody considered it worth visiting. She was shown to her quarters by a servant girl who was young and apparently simple, and who, Isolde noted, positioned herself between Isolde and every door they passed in the corridors in a way that could be read as deferential closeness, but was actually, she was nearly certain, a physical management of her sightlines. The servant girl was steering her, gently, invisibly, in a way that most people would never notice because most people are not paying attention to their sightlines when they're being shown to a room. Isolde was always paying attention to her sightlines. The quarters were comfortable, more comfortable than she had expected, better furnished, better maintained than the exterior presentation of the stronghold suggested the pack could afford. She noted this without reacting to it. Lyra, unpacking their travel bags with the cheerful efficiency that made her invaluable as a traveling companion, commented that the linens were surprisingly fine. Isolde agreed pleasantly and began memorizing the layout of the room. 2 windows, both facing the inner courtyard, both with shutters that opened inward, both positioned high enough to observe the courtyard below without being easily observed from it. A single door. The corridor outside, from what she had read in the walk from the entrance, ran east toward the main hall and west toward, she wasn't certain. The servant girl had kept her moving at a pace that prevented the kind of casual glancing that reveals corridor geography. She sat by the window and looked at the inner courtyard for 2 hours while Lyra prepared her formal presentation clothing and talked about the journey. The courtyard below was active but not busy, a dozen people moving through it in the course of the 2 hours, all of them with the particular purposeful quality she had noticed in the gate soldiers. Nobody wandered, nobody stood in conversation for more than 30 seconds before both parties moved on. The movement patterns were efficient in a way that suggested the courtyard's layout had been designed for efficient movement, which was something you designed into a military facility and not into the organic growth of a residential stronghold. She dressed for the formal reception and said nothing about any of this to Lyra. Alpha Rendrick of the Kerveth pack was not what she had pictured. She had composed an image in her mind over 3 months of preparation. The alpha of a weak, forgotten pack, a man defined by his territory's limitations, carrying in his bearing the particular defeat of someone who has spent a lifetime being underestimated. She had expected something between resignation and compensatory aggression, the kind of man who performs strength in small contexts because he has no access to large ones. What she found when she was presented to him in the main hall that evening was something else entirely. He was perhaps 35, lean in the way of men who maintain their physical condition as a deliberate practice rather than a byproduct of physical labor. His face was unremarkable in the way that is itself remarkable. No distinguishing feature that would make him memorable in a crowd, which in her experience was not a natural accident, but an achieved quality, the specific absence of expression that a person cultivates when they have decided that being forgettable is strategically preferable to being noticed. His eyes, when they met hers in the moment of formal introduction, were the specific dark grey of river stones in winter, and they moved over her face with an assessment that lasted exactly as long as a polite greeting warranted, and then stopped. But she had caught it. In that brief interval of assessment, she had seen something in his eyes that was not the performed warmth of a host welcoming an important guest, and not the calculating appraisal of an alpha evaluating a political acquisition, and not the uncomfortable interest of a man meeting the woman he was about to marry. What she had seen, in the 3 seconds of his eyes on her face, was the specific alertness of someone who was trying to determine, rapidly and accurately, how much she had already noticed. He was reading her. And he was reading her in exactly the way she had been. Reading everything since she crossed the Kerveth border. The formal dinner was precisely what a formal dinner in a modest pack stronghold should be. The food was good, but not extravagant. The hall was clean, but not decorated beyond functional standards. The conversation was diplomatic, light, structured around the expected topics of a first meeting between alliance families, territorial histories, seasonal conditions, the kind of information exchange that signals goodwill without revealing anything of substance. Rendrick was an excellent conversationalist in the way that is indistinguishable from a mediocre one if you are not paying close attention. He said everything appropriate and nothing significant, held the surface of the conversation with easy competence, and gave her nothing to work with. She gave him nothing either. She was pleasant, properly warm, appropriately curious about her new territory. She asked the questions a young woman in her position would be expected to ask. She laughed at the right moments. She was fairly certain, a convincing performance of someone who had not spent the last 6 hours cataloguing the structural inconsistencies of a pack that didn't behave anything like what it claimed to be. When the dinner ended and she was escorted back to her quarters, she lay awake for a long time in the darkness and thought about his eyes in the moment of first assessment, about the specific quality of his alertness, about the fact that the most interesting thing she had found in her first day in the Werewolf territory was not a hidden soldier or a locked door or a forbidden corridor. It was the way its alpha looked at her when he thought he was the only one paying attention. The first week passed in the structured rhythm of formal introduction, presentations to pack elders, tours of the stronghold's common areas, meals with the inner household, the careful social choreography of a newcomer being absorbed into an established community. Isolde moved through all of it, with the patient attention of someone who understands that the most important information in any environment is almost never the information being offered. It lives in the periphery, in the things people don't say, in the routes they don't take you on, and the doors they navigate you past without appearing to navigate you past them. She was being managed, carefully, professionally, with a thoroughness that spoke of practice. Her movements within the stronghold were never obviously restricted. There were no guards at her door, no formal boundaries stated, no rules about where she could and couldn't go. The management was softer than that and correspondingly harder to resist, because you can push back against a stated rule in ways that you cannot push back against a social current. Every morning, her schedule was gently filled with activities that kept her in the eastern wing of the stronghold. Every afternoon, some member of the household was available to accompany her on walks that reliably turned back before they reached the western sections of the grounds. Every question she asked about the territory beyond the immediate stronghold was answered with a warmth and a thoroughness that somehow never quite included the information she had actually been looking for. She was good at this. She had grown up in a household that ran on managed information and had learned, very young, to extract the real shape of a situation from the edges of what she was being told. But the Werewolf household was better at this than anything she had previously encountered, better trained, more consistently applied. The management of her information environment was so smooth that she was fairly certain most people would have been living inside it for weeks without realizing it was constructed. On the 9th day, she found the first crack. It was small, the kind of thing that only exists as a crack if you are already looking for the wall. She had developed over the first week a detailed mental map of her allowed territory within the stronghold, the rooms she had been shown, the corridors she had walked, the courtyard spaces available to her. She had also developed, with the careful patience of someone who knows that rushing an investigation is the fastest way to close the doors you're trying to open, a preliminary map of what lay beyond the managed boundaries. Inferences drawn from architectural logic, from the behavior of servants moving through the parts of the building she couldn't access, from the specific quality of the silence that came from certain directions at certain times of day. The western section of the stronghold was larger than it appeared from outside, significantly larger. The external dimensions of the building, which she had assessed from the courtyard and from her upper window observations, did not match the interior geography she had been shown. There was space, considerable space, that she had not been taken through. This could be explained by storage, by sections of the building that were unused and simply not part of a guest's tour. Old strongholds accumulated dead spaces. It was not inherently suspicious. What was suspicious was the temperature differential. On cold mornings, standing in the eastern corridor that ran closest to the internal boundary of her allowed territory, she could feel a faint warmth coming through the stone wall to her left. Not the warmth of heated rooms, the specific warmth of occupied space, of a large number of bodies generating heat in an enclosed area. Stone holds and releases warmth in patterns that are readable if you know what you're reading and what she was reading on the 9th cold morning, standing with her hand resting apparently casually against the eastern corridor wall, was occupancy. A significant amount of it, immediately beyond a wall she had never been shown the other side of. She filed it. She moved on. She gave nothing away. The crack in her composure came on the 14th day, and it came from a direction she hadn't been watching carefully enough because she had been focused on the building's architecture and not on its people. Specifically, it came from the third son of the pack's senior elder, a young man named Thomas who was 19 years old, genuinely friendly in a way that didn't read as performed, and catastrophically bad at remembering which version of the pack's presentation he was supposed to maintain around different audiences. Thomas had been assigned, she understood this now in retrospect, as a social companion for her, young, non-threatening, chatty, the kind of company that fills a newcomer's days with enough social warmth that the managed isolation of their information environment feels like hospitality rather than constraint. He was good at this role. He was also, on the 14th day, slightly tired and slightly distracted by something she couldn't immediately identify, and when she asked him, in the course of a perfectly normal conversation about the pack's winter preparations, a question about supply storage in the western sections of the stronghold, he answered it. Not fully, not in a way that would read as a revelation to anyone who wasn't already holding the partial map she had spent 14 days constructing. He answered it in the way tired people answer questions, with the first true response that comes to mind, before the layer of managed response catches up. He mentioned a supply rotation, a specific supply rotation with a cadence and a scale that was wildly inconsistent with the visible population of the Kayaveth stronghold. The quantities he referenced, casually in passing, already moving on to the next sentence, implied a logistical operation feeding and supplying a population 3 to 4 times larger than the stronghold's visible complement. She let the conversation continue without missing a beat. She laughed at his next comment. She steered them onto a different subject with the ease of someone who hadn't just received the most significant piece of information she had found in 2 weeks. And Thomas, who was 19 and tired and had already moved past it, never knew the gift he had given her. She spent that night building the new architecture of what she knew, the warmth through the wall, the supply rotation scale, the precision of the soldiers, the efficiency of movement patterns in the courtyard, the managed sightlines, the corridors she hadn't been taken through. Rendrick's eyes in the moment of assessment, all of it came together, in the organized structure of her memory, into a shape that was coherent, and that she did not yet fully believe, even as she could not find any flaw in its logic. The Kayaveth pack was not what it appeared to be. The poverty, the weakness, the submission, it was a construction, a deliberate, sustained, extraordinarily well-maintained performance. And behind it, in the space between what was shown and what was hidden, something was growing that the rest of the kingdom had no idea existed. She needed to see the western section. She needed to see it before the next stage of the formal marriage proceedings locked her more securely into the social rhythms of the household, which she had calculated would happen within the next 10 days. After the formal bonding ceremony, her freedom of movement, already managed, would be managed differently, with different social expectations around an alpha's mate that would make independent investigation significantly harder. 10 days. She needed a way through a wall she wasn't supposed to find, past management she wasn't supposed to notice, without triggering the awareness of a household that was, she now understood, considerably more sophisticated than its presentation suggested. She found the way on the 17th day, not through cleverness, or not only through cleverness, through patience, and through the specific kind of attention that allows you to recognize an opportunity in the moment it exists, rather than 3 seconds after it has closed. A door in the eastern corridor, one she had passed dozens of times, was left unlatched on the 17th morning by a servant whose hands were full of linens and who pulled it shut behind her without checking the catch. Isolde was 6 steps behind her. She saw the door fail to latch. She saw the servant's back retreating down the corridor. She looked at the door for 1 second, which was all the time she had to make the decision. She went through. The corridor beyond was identical in construction to the eastern sections. Same stone, same ceiling height, same torch brackets at regular intervals. It ran west and slightly downward, which told her she was moving toward the lower ground level of the structure's western extension. She moved quickly and quietly, with the precise footfall she had learned as a child, in a household where being heard moving through corridors at unusual hours had consequences. She passed 2 doors, both closed, and did not stop. She was looking for the source of the warmth. She was looking for what the supply rotation was feeding. She found it at the end of the corridor, through a heavy door that opened onto a descending staircase. And at the bottom of the staircase was a space so far beyond anything she had been constructing in her mental model that she stood at the threshold of it for several seconds, simply processing what she was seeing. It was vast. The original stronghold above was, she now understood, a surface structure built above a system of excavated chambers that extended deep into the rock of the hillside. The chamber she was standing at the entrance of was the size of a training ground, because it was a training ground, and in it, in the particular clarity of the moment before you understand something that changes everything, she saw them. Hundreds of soldiers. Not the mismatched, under-equipped border guard of the Serveth surface presentation. These were warriors in full standardized equipment, armor that matched, weapons that were maintained to a quality she had not seen outside of the most elite forces in her father's pack, moving through training formations with the absolute precision of a unit that had been drilling together for years. The sound of it was the low, controlled sound of professional military training, commands given at functional volume, not the performative barking of parade ground discipline, the specific audio signature of people who practice as they intend to fight. She stood and she counted. Not the total. The total was beyond her ability to count in the seconds she had. But she counted sections, estimated densities, multiplied by the chamber's visible floor space, and the number she arrived at was a number that did not belong in the territory of the weakest pack in the eastern region. It belonged to an army, a real one, prepared, equipped, disciplined, and entirely invisible to every political calculation she had ever heard applied to the Serveth pack. She was still standing at the threshold when she heard, from directly behind her, a voice she recognized. "You're faster than I expected," Rendrick said. "I thought we had another week." She turned. He was standing 4 steps behind her, alone, in the corridor. Not angry, not alarmed. His expression had the quality she now understood was his real face, not the performed mildness of the surface. Presentation, but something considerably more complex. The assessment was back in his eyes, sharper now, without the social covering of a formal dinner. She held his gaze and said nothing. She was calculating very rapidly. "You're not going to run," he said. It wasn't a question. "Where would I run to?" she said. "And why would I?" Something shifted in his face, not surprise. She was beginning to understand that Rendrick did not surprise easily. Something more considered, a reassessment. "Most people," he said, "when they find something they weren't supposed to find, react. They run or they attack or they ask the obvious question too loudly." "I'm not most people," she said. "No," he said. "You're not. I noticed that at dinner." He looked past her at the training chamber for a moment, with the expression of a man looking at something he has spent a very long time building. Then he looked back at her. "You have questions?" "Several hundred," she said. "Which one do you want answered?" "First," she looked at him for a long moment. In the chamber behind her, the training continued. The controlled sound of hundreds of soldiers moving through their formations. The sound of something enormous and patient and ready. "How long?" she said. "How long have we been building this?" "Yes." "My grandfather started it," he said. 60 years ago, after the last major territorial war, when the Serveth lost a third of their land to the Valdris expansion." He paused, and she felt the specific weight of that, the Valdris expansion, her father's pack, the history she had grown up inside without ever being told this side of it. He made a decision, not to fight back immediately, which we couldn't have survived, to become invisible, to let every other pack in the region believe we had accepted the loss, accepted the diminishment, accepted the role of the territory that didn't matter. His voice was entirely level. Not the level of suppressed emotion, the level of someone who has had a very long time to arrive at peace with a very large thing, and to use that invisibility to build something that would make the loss impossible to repeat. She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, the sound of the army. Ahead of her, the man who had inherited 60 years of invisible preparation. "And me," she said. "Why request the marriage? Why bring a Valdris daughter into the center of this?" He held her gaze. "Because the time is coming," he said. "And when it comes, what happens between Kervith and Valdris will determine whether this ends with a new order or with a destruction that benefits no one. I needed to understand the Valdris pact from the inside. I needed someone from inside your household who was capable of understanding what they were seeing." He paused. "And I needed to know before anything begins whether the daughter of the man who took our land 20 years ago was someone I could trust." The word landed in the chamber between them with the particular weight of a thing that is both a question and an answer simultaneously. She had been sent here as an insult, as a disposal, as the proof that her father considered this territory valueless, and she was standing at the threshold of a hidden army 60 years in the making, looking at the man who had specifically requested her because he had understood, somehow, from a distance, that she was not what her father's dismissal made her appear to be. The revelation of it moved through her slowly, with the specific quality of understanding that changes not just what you know, but what you understand about everything that came before. "You've been watching my family," she said. "For 20 years," he said. "You specifically for 6 months before the request. You knew what I was." "I suspected," he said. "I needed to confirm it." He gestured very slightly toward the chamber behind her. "You confirmed it in 17 days. I told Corvus 18. She looked at him for a long moment, the sound of the army behind her, the weight of what she was holding, the secret she had found, the history she had been placed inside without understanding it, the choice that was already forming in the space between everything she had just learned. "You said the time is coming," she said. "What does that mean exactly?" He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at her with the assessment that she was beginning to understand was simply how he thought, not evaluating her as a threat or an ally in the binary way of most political minds, but building a model of her in real time with the same patience and precision that had built the chamber behind her. "It means," he said finally, "that I'm going to need to decide how much to tell you. And that decision depends on something I can't fully calculate yet." "What?" "Whether you're still your father's daughter," he said, "or whether you're something else." The question hung between them in the corridor, with the controlled sound of 60 years of preparation moving in the chamber below, and she understood, with the full weight of a transformation already in progress, that the answer she gave in the next few moments would determine not just her own future, but the shape of a war that the rest of the kingdom didn't know was already decided. Drop a comment that says, "I was never supposed to find this," because neither was she, and what she decides next is the moment everything breaks open. She answered him. Not immediately. She gave herself the 3 seconds she needed, not to decide, but to be certain that she had already decided, that the answer forming in her chest was not fear or confusion, or the reflex of loyalty to a household that had sent her here as something disposable. 3 seconds to confirm that what she was about to say was true. In the deepest sense, she understood truth to operate. "I stopped being my father's daughter," she said. "The moment he sent me somewhere he believed didn't matter." Rendrick looked at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she had arrived in the Kervith territory, his face did something she hadn't seen it do. It settled. Not into warmth exactly. He was not a man built for easy warmth, and she was beginning to understand that about him, the way you understand the architecture of a building you've decided to live in. It settled into something that was closer to recognition. The specific quality of a man who has been holding a very large thing alone for a very long time and has just found unexpectedly someone capable of holding part of it with him. "Then come with me," he said. "There's more you need to see." What came after that was the real education, not the discovery of the army, That had been the first layer, the surface revelation, the thing that would have satisfied a less careful observer and sent them running for the border with their intelligence. What lay beneath the army was the full architecture of 60 years of invisible preparation, and walking through it with Rendrick as her guide was the most disorienting experience of her adult life. Not because it was frightening, though it was, because it was coherent, because every piece of it, examined in sequence, revealed a mind, several minds across 3 generations, that had approached the problem of survival and justice with a patience and a structural sophistication that she had never encountered at this scale. The weapons were the second revelation. Stored in the deep chambers below the training ground, maintained with a precision that matched the soldiers above them. Not the standard armaments of pack warfare. These were different. Some were designs she recognized from historical accounts of conflicts that had ended generations ago. Weapons that had been formally prohibited by the territorial accords that followed those conflicts, specifically because of the advantage they conferred. The prohibition had been treated, by every pack in the region, as a settled matter, a historical footnote. Nobody had considered that a pack patient enough to build a hidden army over 60 years might also be patient enough to spend those 60 years quietly perfecting the manufacture of weapons that everyone else had stopped thinking about. She stood in front of the storage vaults and understood, in a way that moved through her body before it fully reached her mind, what this meant in practical terms. The other packs in the region had been having a different conversation about military power than the Kayveth for 60 years. They had been talking about visible strength, pack size, territorial resources, alliance networks, the things you could count and compare and use to establish dominance hierarchies. Kayveth had been having a conversation about asymmetric advantage, about what a smaller force could do to a larger one if the smaller force had spent decades preparing precisely the capabilities that the larger force had decided weren't worth worrying about anymore. The third revelation was the network. This was the one that restructured everything else she had thought she understood, including things she had believed she understood about her own history. Rendrick showed her the records. Not all of them. Not that night, but enough. Enough to demonstrate the scope of it. The Kayveth had been building a clandestine alliance network for 40 years, woven through the same regional political landscape that everyone believed they had been excluded from. Not through formal channels, through the spaces formal channels don't reach. Through trade relationships that looked like the desperate commerce of a struggling territory and were actually the infrastructure of an intelligence and resource network that connected to 11 separate packs across 4 territories. Through marriages, other marriages, not hers, smaller and less politically visible, placed carefully over decades into households at every level of the regional hierarchy. Through the specific social invisibility of people and territories that more powerful actors have decided aren't worth watching. She thought about her father, about the precise, stone-cutter's mind that had looked at this territory and seen nothing worth the cost of a valued daughter. She thought about the word her father had used, irrelevant. She had been carrying that word as a wound since the conversation in his study. Standing in the archive room of the Kayveth deep chambers, surrounded by 40 years of invisible preparation, she felt the wound close into something harder. Not anger, not quite. The specific transformation of a hurt that has found its correct context and become, in that context, a form of clarity. Her father had built his power on the assumption that he could accurately identify what mattered and what didn't. That assumption had a 60-year gap in it that was about to become visible to everyone. Rendrick watched her read. He was good at giving people space to process, another quality she was cataloguing. The patience of a man who had grown up in a household where 60 years of patience was the family inheritance, where every generation had practiced the discipline of waiting for the right moment rather than the satisfying one. She appreciated it. She was not a fast processor of the kind that needs to fill silence with reaction. She processed slowly and completely, and she needed the silence he gave her to do it properly. "When you say the time is coming," she said finally, not looking up from the records, "you mean you're close to being ready?" "We've been ready for 8 years," he said. "What we've been waiting for is the right conditions, the right moment in the political cycle where the other packs are sufficiently distracted by their own dynamics that a move from an unexpected direction has maximum impact before they can coordinate a response." She looked up. "And you believe those conditions are arriving?" "3 things have to align," he said. "The Ironmere succession, which is unstable and getting more so. The Valdris-Thornwall trade dispute, which is consuming your father's political attention in ways that reduce his capacity for peripheral awareness. And a 4th pack willing to declare openly on our side at the moment of maximum pressure, which creates the alliance visible enough to cause the others to hesitate rather than immediately consolidate against us." He paused. "2 of the 3 are already in place." She set down the record she was holding. "Which pack?" she said. "The 4th. He looked at her with the assessment, the real one, not the social version. "That," he said, "is what I haven't been able to confirm. The pack I need won't commit until they have certainty about the Valdris position, because if Valdris immediately consolidates against us, the 4th pack's declaration becomes a liability rather than an asset. What they need to know, what I need to know, is whether Valdris fights for the old order," he let a silence develop, "or whether Valdris has someone inside it who might change the calculation." The weight of what he was saying arrived in full. He hadn't requested the marriage only to study the Valdris household. He hadn't brought her here only to confirm that she was the kind of person who could see through the performance. He had brought her here because if things went the way he was building them to go, there would be a moment, a specific, critical moment. In the political unraveling that was coming, when someone with direct standing in the Valdris bloodline, someone who understood both sides of the board, someone who had crossed from one world to the other with open eyes, would be the single most important variable in determining whether the coming transformation became a new order or a catastrophic war. He had brought her here because he needed her to be a bridge, and he had done it without telling her, which meant he had needed to trust that. She would arrive at the understanding herself, through her own investigation, through her own assessment, in a way that was genuinely her own and not the product of his framing. He had needed her to choose it freely. She understood all of this in the space of about 4 seconds. She held it for several more without speaking. "You took a significant risk," she said finally. "Yes," he said, with the directness of a man who doesn't dress risks in softer language. "It could have gone differently. I could have been exactly what my father sent. Someone who didn't look, didn't notice, would have spent the required time here and gone back to Valdris with nothing." "It could have," he said. "I calculated it was unlikely. Based on 6 months of watching a woman you'd never met from a distance. Based on 6 months of watching the things you did when you believed nobody significant was paying attention," he said. "Which is the most accurate version of a person available. Anyone can perform in observed conditions. What you do in the spaces between observation is who you actually are." She was quiet for a long moment. The deep chambers of the Kerveth stronghold were cool and still around them, 60 years of hidden work stored in the walls, hundreds of soldiers sleeping above them in the warmth her hand had detected through a stone wall 17 days ago. The army that wasn't supposed to exist, the weapons that weren't supposed to exist, the network that wasn't supposed to exist, all of it patient and ready and waiting for a moment that was almost here. "I need time," she said. "You have some," he said. "Not a great deal, but some." "How much?" He considered. "The Ironmere succession will resolve one way or another within 60 days. That's the triggering event. After that, the window opens and stays open for approximately 3 weeks before the political dynamics shift into a configuration less favorable to movement. 60 days. She had arrived in the Kerveth territory, believing she was being sent to an irrelevant posting in a forgotten pack on the edge of a territory nobody cared about. She had been here 17 days. In 60 more, she would need to have made the most consequential decision of her life. And possibly she was beginning to understand one of the most consequential decisions in the region's political history. The days that followed were the strangest of her life. She existed in two simultaneous realities, moving between them with the discipline that her upbringing had built into her, and that this situation was now demanding at a level beyond anything she had previously required of it. On the surface, in the visible life of the Werewolf household, she was the newcomer finding her place, attending to the social rhythms of pack life, building relationships with the household members, performing the gradual integration of a young woman settling into an unfamiliar home. She was good at it. She had always been good at the performance of normal. Below the surface, she was learning the full scope of what Rendrik had built. Each day brought new depth to the architecture she was mapping, not just the military and the weapons and the network, but the philosophy behind them. The 60-year strategy was not simply the product of a desire for revenge or territorial recovery, though those motivations lived in its history. It had evolved across 3 generations of Werewolf leadership into something more considered. A genuine theory of how pack political structures failed their populations, and a specific vision of what a restructured regional order could look like if built on different foundations than the dominance hierarchies that had produced over and over the cycles of conflict that periodically destroyed everything everyone had built. Rendrik was the 3rd generation of this vision. He had grown up inside it the way she had grown up inside the Valdris household's assumptions about power, except that his inheritance was a project, and hers had been a position, and projects require understanding while positions only require occupation. He knew the theory behind every decision that had been made before him. He had added to it, refined it, carried it forward with the specific combination of intellectual rigor and emotional investment that characterized everything she was learning about how he operated. They talked, not always strategically. That surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. He was a man who had spent a great deal of time being strategically isolated, whose inner life had been largely conducted in the space of the long project he was carrying. He was not socially empty. The warmth was there. It was simply deep rather than surface, the warmth of someone who has learned not to perform it in contexts where performance invites vulnerability. With her, in the evenings after the household had quieted and they sat in the study where he did his actual thinking, the warmth was available. She found herself looking forward to those evenings in a way that she examined with the same careful attention she applied to everything, and found that it was genuine rather than strategic, which was its own kind of revelation. She was not supposed to find this place. She was not supposed to find any of this. She had been sent as a dismissal, as an insult, as the proof that her family considered her expendable, and she had found, in the territory that nobody considered worth the effort, something that was remaking her understanding of everything she had grown up believing about where power lived and who was worth watching. The question of what she would do with what she knew was growing heavier as the days passed. 30 days remaining until the Ironmere succession, then 28, then 25. She sent no messages to Valdris. She knew that Rendrik knew this, and that it was being noted without being addressed, and that the space she was being given to arrive at. Her decision in her own time was a form of respect she was not accustomed to receiving, and did not intend to waste by filling it before she was ready. On the 42nd day, something happened that she hadn't anticipated, which was rare enough to be significant in itself. A message arrived at the Werewolf stronghold from her father, not addressed to her, addressed to Rendrik, in the formal diplomatic register of pack-to-pack communication. She was not supposed to know about it. She knew about it because she had spent 42 days building a picture of every information flow in the household and had positioned herself, without appearing to do so, to be aware when significant external communications arrived. She did not read it. She didn't need to. She read instead the effect of it, the subtle shift in Corvus's bearing after he carried it from the gate to Rendrik's study, the specific quality of Rendrik's stillness when she saw him at dinner that evening, the way the senior soldiers in the household moved slightly differently in the following 2 days. Something in her father's message had changed the timeline. She didn't know the content. She knew the effect, and the effect told her that the 60 days she had been given had just been shortened. She went to Rendrick that night without waiting for the usual hour. He was in the study, standing at the window, and he turned when she entered with the expression of a man who had been expecting this and was relieved it was happening now rather than later. He handed her the message without preamble. Her father was recalling her, not immediately, in 30 days, at the next formal diplomatic exchange. The language was polite and absolute. He had decided, the message said, that the Kerveth alliance was less politically advantageous than initially assessed, and that Isolde's placement could be better utilized elsewhere. He offered compensatory trade terms as a diplomatic cushion for the withdrawal. He did not explain further. He was pulling her out. 30 days, and the Ironmere succession was moving faster than anticipated. Rendrick told her this now, his voice carrying the controlled weight of someone accelerating a calculation they had hoped to have more time for. The window was not 60 days, it was 30, maybe less. She held the message for a long moment. Her father's precise language, the stonecutter's efficiency of it, the complete absence of consideration for what she might have built here, what she might have become here, what she might have found in the territory he had dismissed as worthless. He was moving her like a piece on a board, back to a position he found more useful, with the same confidence in his own assessment that had sent her here as a disposal in the first place. She set the message down on Rendrick's desk. She looked at him, and she asked the question that made everything that came after inevitable. "Tell me what you need me to do." The answer he gave her was, the beginning of the end of the world the rest of the kingdom thought they were living in, because what he needed was not a spy, not a saboteur, not someone to carry information through enemy lines. What he needed was someone who could walk back into the Valdris household, if she chose to go, if her father's recall was the vector rather than the obstacle, and do something that required being simultaneously completely trusted and completely clear-eyed. He needed someone who could look at her, father's power, and tell the truth about it, not as a betrayal, as a correction, as the thing that might, if the timing was right and the communication was precise, be the difference between a war that destroyed everything and a transformation that rebuilt it. The most dangerous territory in the kingdom was not the one with the largest army. It was not the one with the prohibited weapons or the clandestine alliances. It was the space inside a single person's understanding, where loyalty to what they had come from and clarity about what they had found could either collapse into each other or be held carefully in the specific tension of someone who understood both sides of a board that was already in motion. Isolde held that tension. She had been built for it without knowing it, by everything her life had given her and denied her in equal measure. The border territory daughter, the dispensable piece, the woman sent to a place that didn't matter. She was about to become the most important person in a war that nobody else knew had already started. If you made it all the way here, drop a comment saying, "I was never supposed to find this." Because just like Isolde, you found something you weren't expected to find, and that means this story was already yours. If this video held you from the first second to this one, the like is just the quiet way of saying so. And there's a video right next to this one that continues this kind of story. Same depth, same pull, same world. Click it and stay a little longer.